Deep within the wild woodlands of the Constitution State, there is a road just 7 miles long with a unique and a revealing history. Tucked in the southeast corner against the backdrop of rolling hills and sleepy towns, Route 11 was once envisioned as the pivotal connector between the bustling seaport of New London and the capital city of Hartford. It was never finished. The brainchild of Highway Commissioner Albert G. Hill stands today as a half-completed highway, a testament to the failure of the industry in many regards to service the needs of its people. Today, Route 11 goes by a number of names, my favorites being Route 5.5, and especially the road to nowhere. This is a picture of Route 11 today. Notice the way the road cuts cleanly through the rocks and how the slight curvature through the land remains unchanged since its initial placement some 7 decades ago. See how the sky in the horizon bears no skyline in the distance and no glimpse of shadowy road for miles and miles to come. What happened here is the story of the highway, what was once the great hallmark of American ingenuity now showing its ugly underbelly. This project and others illustrate the potential for highway construction to negatively impact our society, intendedly or unintendedly, with its size, its placement, and especially its lack of sustainability. Looking at the great state of Connecticut, the small yet heavily traveled state, sandwiched between the 2 major cities of Boston and New York, there are many examples of the destructive effects of highway development on our society. Within Connecticut, the greatest example of this impact can be found by examining the long overlooked stories of 2 Connecticut cities, Hartford and New Haven. Each has experienced its own challenges due to, 1, the physical toll the highways play in dividing communities, and 2, the subsequent divisions in demographics, standard of living, and community relations that evolve simultaneously. Due to highway construction, the histories and cultures of these 2 major Connecticut cities were torn away suddenly, erratically, and in a way that has left urban planners reeling in its wake. Hartford lost her river, and with the creation of I-91, her world-famous Front Street District and city center. New Haven, though its original cord was spared, lost most of its historic Long Wharf to a planned stretch of I-95. The loss of opportunity that accompanied the highways was only reinforced by the practices of redlining and discriminatory housing policies that created communities of generational poverty instead of generational wealth. I'm from the suburbs of Hartford. I come from a town just northeast called South Windsor, Connecticut. I moved there 2 decades ago along with my family, and at the time, it was a small, quaint farming community, a few developments here, a few developments there. And over time, as the fields started to give way to housing developments, I began to notice how the landscape quickly changed. But all the while, through my bedroom window, I could count on seeing that Traveler's Tower from Hartford and its red light peeking through. Little did I know, and I didn't find out, in fact, until I left South Windsor, on how real and apparent the structural inequities are within our cities today. The highways that divide Hartford crippled neighborhoods from joining with other neighborhoods and prevented the ability of kids my age from traveling to one end of the city versus another. There was no highway that went by my house. But ultimately, this is the truth. Our highway development as it currently exists underserves those communities that need it most. Take Hartford. In 1868, famous satirical author and later resident Mark Twain once said, "Of all the beautiful towns it has been my fortune to see, this is chief." Not many could argue with him. In the late 19th century, Hartford was disputedly the wealthiest city in America. As this picture from 1904 shows, the small city was at the epicenter of a larger movement of urbanization and industrialization that had taken the country by storm. The insurance capital of the world, as it was known, originated as a humble upriver fishing port on the state's main artery, the Connecticut River. Further, the spirit of its many businesses embodied Yankee ingenuity, as the small state was positioned at the forefront of some of the greatest technological advancements in the world. Eventually, old farms would give way to Victorian streetways of the highest grandeur, and this urbanization at the turn of the 20th century attracted immigrants who came from all over the world. Poles, Italians, Germans, Irishmen lived in small neighborhoods throughout the city and were pivotal in forming a rich and diverse melting pot of cultures that in many ways still exist today. By 1920, Hartford was a modern U.S. city with a proper skyline and a global reputation to match. In the post-World War II America of 1950, the city boasted a population that had rapidly risen to over 175,000 residents, who had filled its many manufacturing plants, its skyscrapers, and its streets. This map of the city, from an index taken in 1880, shows that Hartford's core was predominantly and clearly concentrated around the river crossing with East Hartford. The businesses that prospered in this Front Street district were revered throughout the state, and many people flocked to the city seeking new opportunities. But Connecticut, like many states during the 1930s, was recovering from the Great Depression and was confronted with a new set of challenges. Among these, replacing its largely broken infrastructure of cobblestone city streets and dirt country roads. Construction of what would later become I-91 started in the 1940s, and initially focused in the North Meadows area and the northeast waterfront of the city. One of President Eisenhower's goals was to establish America's modern interstate highway system, which cleared the way for developers to not only continue the building of I-91 to skirt the entirety of the Hartford riverfront, but also to build I-84 as an east-west artery through the city. Over the late 50s and early 60s, the Front Street district was systematically cleared to make way for the modern needs of Connecticut's residents. This construction effectively reduced this once powerful city to a pass-through, a place with neighborhoods that had turned into populated islands in a sea of concrete. The dark side of this development is evidenced more in a 1937 report that details the regions of quote-unquote prosperity throughout the city, and recognized that much of the original Front Street neighborhood relied on the significant contributions of the city's poorest residents. Specifically, with racial minorities, the sections of Hartford bulldozed in the name of infrastructure displaced many of the city's most vibrant and diverse communities. In the 1970s, the Department of Transportation exclaimed in an assessment that specifically I-84 was an imposing force within the community. What has transpired in time is a decline in population and quality of life for the residents of Hartford. This flight of wealth from the city left a gap that could not be filled by its remaining residents. Within a quarter century, the capital city was reduced to the grim distinction of one of America's poorest and most violent cities. Its highways today deeply divide and scar its impoverished north end from the 21st century skyline of downtown, just south of I-84. Current U.S. Representative John Larson has said in recent years that Hartford could learn from the success of projects such as Boston with their Big Dig and in Seattle. Both of these cities managed to reinvent their messy highway grids and improve the quality of life for its people. But in Connecticut, one inspiring group, Riverfront Recapture, formed in 1981, has made immense progress in developing Hartford's disconnected riverfront into a beautiful network of parks, walkways, and even a convention center. In recent years, the development within the city limits has increased, and the sea of empty parking lots and decaying factories on the fringes of city limits are being transformed into attractive places where people work and live. Plans to expand and revitalize both the I-84 viaduct and the I-91 riverfront corridor have proved as glimmers of hope in reconnecting Hartford's residents to its roots, and more importantly, to each other. Whereas the city of Hartford was in many ways bulldozed by the effects of the highway system constructed within its limits, New Haven has struck a very different chord in its incorporation of the highway grid within its limits. Like Hartford, New Haven suffers from an invasive system of highways that have divided its many communities. It wasn't always this way. For much of New Haven's history, it was an educational, manufacturing, and artistic hub within Connecticut, almost winning its bid to be the Constitution State's capital city. Similar to Hartford's story, once the European population fled outward to form the middle-class suburbs with their wealth, New Haven experienced an influx of African American and Latino residents, unfortunately lacking in the wealth of those who moved to the suburbs. This coincided with the near collapse of manufacturing in New England and throughout Connecticut. and New Haven started to grapple with the reality that it lay directly in the path for the development of the coming I-95 interstate. Following the passage of the 1956 Act, road construction immediately began separating and segmenting entire neighborhoods in Long Wharf, Fairhaven, Worcester Square, and effectively cutting off much of the riverfront from the historic harbor. Route 34 strikes a sore chord with many New Haven residents, who have petitioned in recent years for the highway that cuts messily through the downtown up through College Street to erode its concrete barriers and close the intrusive routes that have separated the city's neighborhoods. As described on the city's own website, following the construction of the highways and the collapse of the city into gradual poverty, its mayors struggled to bring in opportunity and wealth, even with a bustling downtown to show for it. Long Wharf's upscale neighborhoods were completely bulldozed, with a small vestige of the former seaside community still remaining at City Point today. And fortunately, unlike Hartford, the city center and town green were largely left intact from the rapid development that quickly encapsulated, overshadowed, and surrounded it. In 1937, a similar report as the one in Hartford was issued, and in New Haven, the results were arguably even more shocking. I-91, protruding north and splitting the city into east and west, was laid along a historic line in the north center of the city, largely populated by its minority residents. Further, Fall Haven to this day continues to suffer from its disconnection from the rest of the city, and the quality of life in New Haven has been markedly inconsistent throughout its many boroughs. The inequities created from a time in which segregation was still legal and practiced in much of this country have scarred cities like New Haven and Hartford. The harsh realities that make it even harder for the poorest residents of these cities to receive aid and assistance in bettering their circumstances still exist today. This leads us back to an essential question. What can be done to remedy these negative effects? If we've designed our cities so poorly, what room do we have left to expand? The answer ultimately lies in the way that communities around the nation have begun to recognize that we have the ability to control traffic in ways that are not disruptive to the cultural identity and mobility of citizens. We can create opportunities for city residents to enjoy their own neighborhoods, free from concrete jungles and massive infrastructure webs. Widening highways to ease traffic is one solution that's been championed by leaders of the I-84 project in Hartford for preventing congestion. But in alternate proposals, we can put our highways underground and away from our major populous areas and achieve the dual goals of increasing capacity and improving the quality of life and continuity of our neighborhoods. The truth is that now more than ever, young people are returning to the cities, they're investing in the communities, and they're rebuilding. Because the model as we've seen it to this day is unsustainable. And the change isn't going to come all at once. It's not going to happen overnight, but one step at a time. When we reinvest and when we show we care, we can build highways that work for everybody, that don't bulldoze through our glorious cities and don't displace thousands of people in its wake. We can develop a system that includes, incorporates, and preserves the cultures and histories of our cities. I'm reminded of Route 11 when I'm talking about all of this, because the truth is that the current highway system as we know it today is in itself a road to nowhere. I'm excited for this conversation to continue and for Connecticut to serve as a shining example of just how much we have left to go.